Rising from the sun-baked plains, buried beneath dense jungle canopies and carved deep into solid bedrock, sit ancient monuments that completely shatter our accepted timeline of human engineering. While we are often told that these early cultures were just basic hunter-gatherers, the physical evidence left behind tells a very different story. All across the world we find vertical fortresses, sprawling cities made entirely of mud, and perfect geometric cathedrals carved directly into mountainsides. These ancient structures were built on a scale so massive and with such specialized precision that they make us question everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. So join us today as we look at 10 of these sites and investigate how these ancient cultures mastered advanced fluid dynamics, acoustic engineering, and extreme logistical operations, entirely without the help of modern machines. And remember, as always with our videos, while the visuals are there for context, they aren't necessary to enjoy the journey. The stories and the scale of these structures speak for themselves. So sit back, relax, grab a snack, and join us. And if you enjoy in-depth, well-researched documentaries like this every single week, then make sure to subscribe. Now, let's get started. Our journey today begins in the central plains of Sri Lanka. Imagine looking out over miles of sweeping, flat savanna where the wind rolls across endless fields of tall grass before blending into the dense jungle canopy. And rising abruptly through this rolling green landscape is a massive sheer column of solid granite. This towering monolith is called Sigiriya, and it stretches over 200 meters straight up into the sky. It casts a huge shadow over the forest floor below, looking completely out of place as it stands entirely alone, without any other mountains nearby. For hundreds of years, the thick Sri Lankan jungle simply swallowed the site, hiding its secrets under heavy vines and roots. The local people knew the giant stone was there, but the true scale of what was hidden remained completely lost until the 19th century. In 1831, a British Army major named Jonathan Forbes was riding through the area when he spotted the massive granite block towering over the tree line. He quickly organized a team to hack through the heavy brush, wanting to map the base of the rock. What his expedition uncovered in the dirt immediately turned this natural wonder into a massive archaeological mystery. Clearing away centuries of mud, they found heavy brickwork seamlessly built right into the natural stone. The most amazing discovery at the base was a pair of enormous lion paws, carved straight out of the rock and surrounded by thick masonry. These giant claws were originally part of a colossal brick lion that guarded the main stairway to the upper levels. Anyone visiting originally had to walk right through the open mouth of the beast to start their steep climb up the cliff face. Just the sheer size of the entrance hinted that something massive was built high above the jungle floor. History books tell us this entire complex was built by King Kasyapa, who ruled the region around 477 AD. The accepted story says that Kasyapa took the throne by force and lived in constant terror that the rightful heir would return for revenge. Driven by this heavy paranoia, he decided to completely abandon the old capital and move his entire government to the safest place he could find. He chose the flat top of Sigiriya, wanting to build a fortress in the sky to protect his crown. However, the physical ruins left behind show that he built something much more complicated than a basic military bunker. Kasyapa planned a sprawling, highly organized city that stretched far past the bottom of the rock. The western approach to the stone features a massive network of water gardens covering huge sections of the lower plains. These gardens are laid out with perfect symmetry, using a very complex series of retaining walls, terraced pools, and decorative fountains. The organized layout heavily contrasts with the wild, messy jungle around it, showing a society that deeply understood how to control their environment. Just moving the dirt to create these perfectly flat water features is a massive construction project on its own. The real mystery of Sigiriya starts when you look up from the gardens and focus on the top of the 200-meter rock. The flat summit covers roughly 4 acres, and it was once completely covered by a luxurious, multi-level palace. Digging at the top revealed the heavy foundations of massive brick buildings, smooth marble floors, and a series of viewing platforms. It was a fully working royal city, complete with living quarters, meeting halls, and deep pools to catch the rain. The layout is beautiful, but figuring out how ancient workers actually put an entire city on top of a sheer cliff remains highly controversial. Mainstream history usually treats the building of Sigiriya as a normal project, finished by thousands of workers using basic manual labor. That explanation falls apart very quickly when you actually look at the sheer weight of the building materials found on the top. The workers had to carry millions of baked bricks, heavy wooden beams, and massive blocks of imported marble straight up a vertical rock wall. The natural sides of Sigiriya offer almost zero places to step, meaning every single piece of material had to be hauled up using primitive wooden scaffolding or heavy ropes. Even today, tourists get exhausted making the climb using modern steel stairs bolted into the rock. Organizing a crew to carry thousands of tons of heavy material up a cliff while fighting strong winds and dangerous heights is a major logistical nightmare. A single dropped stone or a broken scaffold would cause massive delays and a huge loss of life. When you calculate the man-hours needed, the strength required for the lifting ropes, and the very short length of Kasypa's reign, the math simply does not work out. Academics rarely talk about the physical reality of moving all this material, preferring to focus on the pretty artwork of the palace instead. Ignoring the brutal physical hurdles is just an easy way to avoid explaining how a 5th century workforce actually managed to pull this off. Beyond just moving heavy stone, the most confusing engineering feat at Sigiriya involves the mastery of water. A luxury palace, sitting 200 meters up in the air, needs a massive, constant supply of fresh water to actually function. While the top has pools for rainwater, the dry seasons in Sri Lanka are very harsh, so they needed a much more reliable solution. To fix this, the ancient builders engineered a highly advanced plumbing system designed to move water from the lower lakes all the way up to the palace. They did not do this by just carrying heavy buckets up the stairs, but through a deeply complex network of pressurized pipes. Archaeologists found a huge system of interlocking terracotta pipes buried deep beneath the symmetrical water gardens at the bottom. These ancient pipes run for miles, connecting the outside lakes to the fountains and pools of the lower city. The plumbing is amazingly well preserved and shows a deep understanding of how to keep water pressure steady across different heights and distances. The real shock came when researchers realized this plumbing system was actually designed to push water straight up, directly fighting the natural pull of gravity. Pumping water up a 200-meter vertical cliff takes an immense amount of mechanical pressure, the kind of force we usually associate with modern industrial machines. Modern engineers still argue about exactly what kind of systems the ancient builders used to create and hold that kind of heavy hydraulic force. The internal pressure needed to push water that high would easily explode standard clay pipes, suggesting they used advanced pressure chambers or specialized valves that have completely disappeared over time. These builders clearly understood the mechanics of water in a way that completely breaks our expectations of 5th century technology. Major institutions often treat these water anomalies as neat little footnotes rather than world-changing pieces of physical evidence. When modern science struggles to recreate the pressure systems used by an ancient society, it strongly hints that our history books are missing major pieces of the puzzle. It is highly convenient to label Sigiriya as just a basic fortress built by hand, rather than a hub of advanced ancient engineering. Admitting the true mechanical genius required to build and supply this high-altitude city threatens the straight-line version of human history that we are all taught in school. Pumping water to the sky is an incredible feat of ancient engineering. The builders of Sigiriya mastered the unseen forces of water pressure to conquer their giant granite rock, but carving massive stone monuments directly into the sheer face of a mountain requires a completely different mastery of heights. We now move our timeline back to roughly 1000 to 500 BC, traveling into the dry landscapes of modern-day Iran, where the Zagros Mountains cut sharply across the desert floor to create a huge vertical wall of stone. Carved directly into the upper reaches of this towering cliff face are 4 massive cross-shaped facades. Picture seeing these for the first time, as they hover high above the ground like giant shadowy doorways leading directly into the mountain. Because the sheer scale and extreme altitude create such a striking visual against the empty desert below, the entire site feels deeply unsettling. With no ramps or paths leading up to them, they look as though they were placed there by magic rather than human hands. When early European explorers first found this site, they were completely baffled by the sheer logistics of what they were seeing. Approaching the cliff face from the desert meant the extreme height of the carvings made them completely unreachable for the survey teams, so the explorers had absolutely no way to get to the entrances, leaving them to sketch the huge crosses from a distance while actively debating how the rock was ever cut. Since there were no obvious ledges or stairways to offer a clue, everyone was forced to realize the builders possessed a highly advanced method for scaling vertical stone. It immediately challenged the mainstream narrative of what early cultures were truly capable of achieving. This site is known today as Naqsh-e-Rostam, serving as the royal graveyard for the mighty Achaemenid Empire. Inside this massive burial complex lie the tombs of highly influential historical figures, including legendary rulers like Darius the Great and Xerxes I. Since these were men who commanded vast territories, they possessed the immense wealth and the dedicated workforce to execute huge construction projects. Yet choosing to build a royal graveyard halfway up a sheer cliff face was not a decision driven by simple military strategy or a desire to show off. Historians explain that the location of these tombs was actually deeply tied to the dominant Zoroastrian religious beliefs of the era, because this ancient culture viewed the earth as a deeply sacred element. Burying the dead directly in the soil was thought to severely pollute it. So, to keep the ground pure from human remains, the architects were tasked with elevating the royal tombs entirely out of the dirt. In order to solve this strict religious rule, the builders chose the most physically demanding path available, opting to hollow out the mountains themselves. Behind each of the 4 massive crosses hides a deep internal chamber, cut straight into the solid bedrock to house the royal bodies. While creating a secure tomb is a standard practice for any ancient empire, executing that plan dozens of feet up, a vertical drop turns the project into a major engineering mystery. The true puzzle of Naqsh-e-Rostam lies entirely in the extreme logistics of carving stone at high altitudes. Building a structure from the ground up allows workers to stand on solid earth, adjusting individual blocks and easily correcting minor mistakes as they go. But carving directly downward into a mountain is a completely different story. It leaves absolutely zero margin for error, as a single misplaced strike or deep fracture would completely ruin the entire cross shape, which means the builders had to calculate the exact interior spaces and the perfect exterior lines long before a single piece of rock was removed. For reference, modern construction crews require digital laser mapping and heavy diesel machinery to execute this kind of precision mountain carving today. Yet, the ancient architects somehow achieved the exact same flawless spatial planning without any modern help at all. Experts often suggest the workers simply hung from long ropes, swinging against the rock wall while using heavy mallets to chip away at the stone. However, this explanation simply does not make any sense whatsoever, because a worker hanging from a rope has absolutely no leverage. The force of a heavy hammer swing would just push their body away from the rock face. Delivering the thousands of high-impact strikes needed to hollow out a mountain requires a completely rigid and stable platform. You simply cannot carve perfect right angles and smooth surfaces while dangling in midair from a hemp rope. So, if the workers did not hang from ropes, the only other logical option is the construction of massive wooden scaffolding, spanning the entire height of the cliff. Picture the logistics of hauling thousands of heavy wooden beams into a barren desert to construct a secure platform for hundreds of stonemasons. For reference, erecting a modern scaffolding system of this size requires heavy steel pipes, flatbed transport trucks, and industrial cranes to lock the pieces into place securely. The ancient scaffolding would have to remain perfectly stable while enduring heavy desert winds and supporting the sheer weight of the falling stone. Even if they managed the scaffolding, the mainstream assumption that these flawless facades were created using basic copper chisels simply does not add up. Because copper is a very soft metal, using it to cut perfectly straight lines into the hard bedrock of the Zagros Mountains is incredibly difficult. Grounding this mystery in modern experiments shows just how frustrating this process is, as period-accurate copper tools deform almost instantly when struck against hard rock. The tools would constantly blunt and break against the mountain, slowing progress to a frustrating crawl. Yet the sheer perfection of the cuts and the sharp 90-degree inner corners suggest the use of advanced geometric tooling that is rarely attributed to this era. It is highly convenient for traditional historians to label this as a standard ancient burial site rather than an epicenter of high-altitude engineering. By talking endlessly about the artwork and the religious texts, they actively distract from the glaring construction anomalies staring right at them. The sheer physical reality of this stonemasonry simply doesn't align with the primitive tools assigned to the era. It forces us to ask if these builders had access to construction methods that have been completely lost to time. And so, leaving the high-altitude desert of the Zagros Mountains behind, we journey half a world away to the dense, sweltering jungles of Mexico. Here, an entirely isolated society was busy solving a very different architectural puzzle, mastering the complex flow of pressurized water deep beneath the earth. Deep in the southern reaches of Mexico lies the dense, humid state of Chiapas. It is a landscape completely dominated by a thick, unforgiving rainforest. The air here is heavy, filled with the sounds of wildlife and the constant drip of moisture from the canopy above. During the 19th century, early explorers spent grueling months hacking their way through this solid wall of green. They endured heavy rains and harsh conditions just to map the uncharted territory. What they eventually stumbled upon, hidden completely beneath the overgrown vegetation, were the peaks of massive stone pyramids. These towering structures belonged to Palenque, a sprawling ancient city that the jungle had quietly swallowed whole. When early survey teams arrived in the 1840s, they were hauling heavy equipment and hand-drawing the ruins by campfire light. They looked at the collapsing stone roofs and the overgrown courtyards, viewing the Maya as a lost, highly artistic culture. They could easily see the magnificent surface architecture, but the true civic engineering of the city was buried deep underground. The explorers mapped the beautiful temples and moved on, completely unaware that they were walking directly over a highly advanced ancient utility grid. It would take over a century and a half for modern science to even realize what lay hidden beneath the stone plazas. Palenque actually reached its absolute peak during the classic Maya period, right around the 7th century. This golden age of construction was driven by the long rule of King Pakal the Great. Under his command, the settlement transformed into a massive, highly organized urban center. His architects built a sprawling central palace, grand public plazas, and tall temples covered in incredibly detailed stucco carvings. These carvings record the royal history of the city, depicting the kings and their daily lives. Walking through the ruins today, you can clearly see the layout of a society deeply invested in urban planning. They built massive stone terraces to level out the steep terrain, creating a perfectly flat foundation for their growing capital. Building a stone city in a rainforest presents a very specific set of environmental challenges. The region receives massive amounts of rainfall every single year, and the city itself sits directly at the base of a steep mountain range, which means heavy floodwater constantly flows down the slopes and directly into the city center. For a long time, traditional archaeologists assumed the Maya simply built basic stone trenches to channel this water away from their buildings. They viewed the Maya as brilliant astronomers and sculptors, but generally treated their practical city engineering as fairly basic. That view held strong for decades, until a closer look beneath the surface revealed something entirely unexpected. The true mechanical genius of Palenque was finally uncovered by modern hydroarchaeologist Kirk French. He decided to map the underground water systems of the city, looking to understand exactly how the ancient builders handled the heavy jungle runoff. During his surveys, he and his team zeroed in on a specific underground channel known as the Piedras Bolas Aqueduct. This stone tunnel was fed by a natural spring located much higher up on the mountain. As French traced the path of the aqueduct down the slope, he noticed a deliberate and highly unusual change in the architecture of the tunnel itself. The main tunnel was built wide near the top of the spring to catch a large volume of water. However, as the stone channel moved downhill, the walls were constructed to gradually taper inward. By the time the aqueduct reached the lower city, the opening was dramatically smaller than it was at the source. This narrowing design was not an accident, and it certainly wasn't a shortcut taken by tired builders. By forcing a large volume of water downhill into a much tighter space, the Maya actively created hydraulic pressure. The water shooting out of the lower end of the aqueduct was under enough force to spray upwards of 20 feet into the air. Building this system required incredible foresight and precision. The builders had to carve the limestone blocks to fit together perfectly, sealing the joints tightly, so the water pressure didn't simply burst through the sides of the tunnel. If the taper was too steep, the pressure would destroy the walls entirely. If it was too gradual, the water would just slowly trickle out. They had to calculate the exact ratio of the water volume compared to the decline of the hill. All of this was done using local stone and a flawless grasp of mathematics to create a system that worked perfectly without any modern metal valves or pumps. Finding engineered water pressure in an ancient Mesoamerican city presents a major problem for the established timeline of human invention. Mainstream history books confidently state that pressurized water was strictly an old world invention. It is widely taught in universities that the Romans were the only ancient society capable of engineering this kind of advanced plumbing. The physical evidence at Palenque proves that completely isolated Maya engineers independently mastered the complex physics of fluid dynamics. They did this centuries before any European contact, completely changing what we know about their technological capabilities. This was not just a theoretical science experiment for the Maya. They actively used this pressurized water to greatly improve their daily lives in the city. The force generated by the Piedras Bolas Aqueduct was enough to power decorative fountains in the main plazas, creating a massive display of wealth and control over nature. Even more impressively, it allowed the residents to run fresh, pressurized water directly into their homes. They effectively created a working system of indoor plumbing, right in the middle of a dense jungle over 1,000 years ago. Modern academia often has a very hard time updating the history books when physical evidence like this is found. The narrative that Rome was the absolute peak of ancient engineering is deeply entrenched in the traditional maps of history. When a jungle society is proven to have working indoor plumbing, it is often minimized in the official reports to protect the older theories. The physical reality of finding engineered water pressure hidden under the jungle completely redefines what early societies were capable of. The Maya essentially turned the mountain itself into a hydraulic machine. That exact same approach of using the earth as a tool, rather than just a foundation, appears again thousands of miles away in the highlands of Ethiopia. Only these builders weren't carving narrow stone channels to push water. They were slicing straight down into the volcanic bedrock, pulling entire geometric cathedrals directly out of the ground. Leaving the dense jungles of Mexico, we travel across the world to the mountainous highlands of Ethiopia during the late 12th century. The landscape here is defined by rolling hills and vast stretches of flat, red volcanic rock. Picture standing on a perfectly level expanse of this hard earth, only to suddenly look down into a massive vertical pit. Sitting entirely below ground level at the bottom of this sheer drop is the roof of a perfectly carved, cross-shaped cathedral. Because there is no outward sign of a structure from a distance, the entire site feels incredibly hidden. You literally have to be standing right on the edge of the trench to realize that a massive stone building exists right beneath your feet. History credits this staggering location to King Lalibela. Following a time of heavy regional conflict, he wanted to create a brand new Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims who could no longer safely travel to the actual Holy Land. Rather than building a traditional walled city on the surface, his architects decided to execute a much more radical vision by mapping out an entire religious complex below ground. The site consists of 11 distinct churches, all carved straight down into the volcanic bedrock. Connecting these 11 massive structures is a deeply complex maze of underground tunnels, narrow walkways, and deep trenches. This network allows people to walk between the various cathedrals without ever having to step back above ground. The most famous of these structures is a flawless geometric cross that sinks dozens of feet into the earth. While the religious history is fascinating, the sheer scale of this carving is what truly baffles modern engineers. Building a standard cathedral upward allows a workforce to stack blocks, test the weight of the roof, and easily fix mistakes as the building grows taller. Carving a massive building downward out of a single continuous piece of stone means there is absolutely zero margin for error. A single deep crack in the rock or one heavy misplaced hammer strike would instantly ruin an entire building. The architects had to map out every single room, arched window, and decorated doorway inside the solid rock before the first piece of dirt was ever removed. For reference, executing this kind of precision today requires highly advanced digital modeling software and laser-guided machinery. The ancient Ethiopian builders had to calculate the exact interior spaces and the weight of the stone ceiling using nothing but pure mathematics and spatial awareness. Picture the logistics of hollowing out a room inside a mountain, knowing exactly how much stone to leave on the ceiling so it doesn't collapse on the workers below. The interiors of these churches feature beautifully vaulted ceilings and smooth floors, all carved from the exact same block of bedrock to achieve perfect symmetry in the dark. They had to account for the natural faults hidden inside the stone, adjusting their carved pillars on the fly to support the massive weight above. Recent geological surveys show that they also had to plan highly complex exterior water drainage systems at the exact same time. The region experiences heavy seasonal rains, meaning the trenches had to be perfectly angled to move water away from the stone walls. If the underground water channels were off by even a few degrees, the entire subterranean complex would quickly flood and destroy the churches. They effectively built a massive underground plumbing system out of solid rock. This requires a working knowledge of water management that is rarely credited to a medieval workforce. The physical reality of hollowing out these deep trenches brings up a massive logistical hurdle that traditional history books often gloss over. Carving the stone is only the first step. The workers then had to find a way to manually lift thousands of tons of heavy volcanic rubble straight up out of the deep pits to clear the site. For reference, modern industrial cranes can only lift roughly 50 to 100 tons at a time. The ancient workers had to haul an unbelievable amount of waste rock up sheer vertical walls using highly restricted spaces. Because the trenches are so narrow, there is very little room to set up large wooden lifting frames or heavy ramps. The mainstream timeline aggressively pushes the idea that a small medieval workforce completed this massive removal of rock in just 24 years. Figures who act as firm gatekeepers for this accepted timeline defend the narrative at all costs. They often write off these heavily engineered sites as the simple product of intense religious devotion and basic manual labor. By focusing entirely on the faith of the builders, they actively avoid answering the hard mathematical questions about the required construction rate. To finish 11 underground churches in a few decades, the workers would have to remove a staggering amount of solid rock every single day without a single structural failure. Grounding this mystery in the failure of modern experiments shows a very different physical reality. When modern crews try to recreate this exact type of rock carving using period-accurate hand tools, the metal tools quickly warp and shatter against the dense volcanic stone. The idea that primitive iron picks and chisels could perfectly hollow out 11 massive cathedrals in such a short timeline simply does not add up whatsoever. The tools would require constant sharpening and replacement, slowing the daily progress to an absolute crawl. It highlights a massive gap between the physical evidence in the stone and the simple tools they supposedly had access to. The math regarding the amount of stone removed, the water systems, and the incredibly tight timeline is heavily disputed by independent engineers. It makes us question if our maps of medieval technology are deliberately hiding a much more advanced civilization that possessed building techniques we have yet to discover. Slicing a cathedral completely out of the earth shows a total mastery of solid bedrock. That same staggering command over heavy rock appears again, but driven by a completely different motive. We leave the religious bedrock of Ethiopia and travel to the high, arid Zacatecas Valley of northern Mexico, roughly between 500 and 900 AD. The environment here is entirely unforgiving. Searing sun bakes the dry scrub brush, and heavy winds sweep across a desolate, cracked valley floor. The heat radiates off the ground, making any physical movement exhausting. Rising sharply from this barren expanse is a steep, rocky hill with almost vertical drops on several sides. Anchored directly to the top of this natural vantage point sits a massive, imposing stone citadel. It dominates the empty horizon, standing as an isolated fortress in a landscape that seems completely incapable of supporting human life on a large scale. Walking through the outer defensive walls reveals a sprawling, highly organized complex known today as La Quemada. The site is a masterclass in adapting to difficult terrain. The builders constructed massive stone terraces to flatten the uneven hillside, creating stable foundations for a series of heavy structures. At the heart of the complex is the Hall of Columns, a massive enclosed space that originally featured a high roof supported by thick, cylindrical stone pillars. Nearby sits the votive pyramid, a steep, sharply angled structure rising over 50 feet into the air. Connecting these areas is a network of elevated walkways and sunken plazas, all surrounded by heavy defensive walls designed to repel a massive assault. Beyond the central structures, the site is anchored by a sprawling network of ancient roads. These wide, paved causeways radiate out from the fortress across the valley floor, connecting the citadel to smaller satellite settlements. Building a heavy stone road system in a desert indicates a massive, unified regional power structure, deeply invested in controlling trade and movement across the territory. The architecture is built for permanence, requiring a dedicated, highly skilled workforce. Every heavy block had to be cut, shaped, and hauled up the steep inclines under the brutal desert sun. Sustaining a construction project of this magnitude requires a massive agricultural supply chain and a constant source of water. Neither of these naturally exist in this arid wasteland. The builders had to engineer complex water catchments to trap the rare rainfall, and they likely had to haul fresh water and crops from miles away just to keep their workers alive. Furthermore, supporting the massive roof of the Hall of Columns required enormous wooden beams. Sourcing that much heavy timber meant logging entire forests and dragging the trees across the dry desert floor, adding a staggering layer of logistical difficulty to the build. The presence of such a heavy, static fortress in this specific location is a massive geographical anomaly. Historical records of the Zacatecas Valley describe a region occupied almost exclusively by nomadic tribes, often referred to collectively as the Chichimeca. The harsh conditions forced local populations to remain constantly on the move, chasing scarce seasonal resources and leaving almost no physical footprint behind. Nomadic groups simply do not stop moving to construct massive, columned halls, defensive pyramids, and paved road networks. The sheer volume of stone moved and the specialized engineering required to build La Quemada point to a highly organized, deeply rooted civilization thriving in an area long considered an archaeological dead zone. Despite the impressive scale of the ruins, the site offers absolute silence regarding who actually built it. There are no written records carved into the stone, no identifiable statues, and absolutely no cultural markers tying the fortress to the recognized empires of ancient Mexico. Archaeologists looking for the standard architectural signatures of the Aztec, Toltec, or Maya find nothing. The builders remain a complete ghost society. They possess the advanced knowledge to engineer a massive citadel, yet they operated completely outside the known borders of civilization. They left no clues about their identity, their language, or their true purpose in the desert. They existed as an isolated powerhouse, completely disconnected from the cultural hubs further south. The mystery deepens significantly when examining the dark physical evidence left scattered across the ruins. Excavations throughout the fortress uncovered massive deposits of human bones. These were not formal, organized burials, tucked away respectfully in a cemetery. The remains were heavily fractured, highly disorganized, and thrown across the floors of the plazas and the pyramids. The bone fragments show signs of cut marks and extreme trauma, indicating a sudden, chaotic, and incredibly violent event. Finding massive amounts of broken human remains strewn across the living spaces paints a brutal picture of the final days of this citadel. Adding to this grim scene is a thick layer of ash and deep scorching permanently baked into the stone walls. The name La Quemada actually translates to the burned city, and the physical damage shows exactly why. The fortress did not simply fall into ruin over time through neglect or a slow migration away from the desert. It was consumed by an incredibly intense fire that brought the heavy timber roofs crashing down on top of the columned halls. The extreme heat required to scorch the thick stone walls suggests a deliberate, overwhelming act of destruction. It was a calculated effort to completely erase the site from the map. The physical reality of the site leaves a massive burned scar on the historical record. An unknown civilization built a heavily fortified citadel to protect themselves in an incredibly harsh environment. They mastered the logistics of moving heavy stone and timber across a desert to build an impenetrable stronghold. Yet, an even stronger force eventually arrived at their gates, breached those heavy walls, scattered the defenders, and burned the entire city to ash. The identity of both the builders and the army that destroyed them remains completely unknown. The ruins were then completely abandoned to the desert winds, standing as a silent monument to a forgotten war. The violent end of La Quemada shows the extreme lengths ancient societies went to in order to defend their territories in unforgiving landscapes. While that anonymous society tried to defend stone walls in the north, another culture was busy tackling an equally harsh environment further south, and so we leave the scorched ruins of the Mexican desert and travel down the Pacific coast to the Moche Valley of Peru. This region is one of the driest coastal strips on the planet, a place where the sun bleeds the color out of the earth, and rain is a rare, almost legendary event. Yet, sprawled across 20 square kilometers of this dusty plain, sit the remains of a metropolis that defies every rule of architecture. This is Chan Chan, the imperial heart of the Chimu Empire. Unlike the stone fortresses we have seen elsewhere, this entire city, every wall, every room, and every towering pyramid was built entirely out of unbaked mud. When the Spanish conquistadors first arrived in the 16th century, they were stunned by the scale of what they found. Early chroniclers like Pedro Chiesa de Leon wrote about walls that seemed to stretch forever, describing a city so vast and wealthy that it felt more like a dream than a desert outpost. The Spanish were not there for the architecture, however. They were lured by rumors of walls of gold. They found palaces where the adobe was once sheathed in shimmering precious metals, reflecting the brutal coastal sun. Walking through the ruins today feels like entering a massive earthen labyrinth. The city is divided into 10 distinct royal citadels, or ciudadelas, each one surrounded by thick adobe walls that reach 30 feet into the air. These were not just homes, they were self-contained universes. Each citadel contained its own palaces, plazas, massive storehouses, and even its own burial platform for the king. The Chimu were a highly organized and wealthy society that peaked between 850 and 1470 AD, ruling over 1,000 miles of coastline. They were the undisputed kings of the coast, and Chan Chan was the physical manifestation of their total dominance over the environment. The interior of the city is a masterpiece of clay art. Every surface is covered in incredibly detailed reliefs that repeat in endless, hypnotic patterns. Instead of the typical scenes of war or sacrifice found in other cultures, the Chimu decorated their world with the ocean. You can see miles of carved waves, schools of fish, seabirds, and even the intricate diamond patterns of fishing nets. These designs were pressed into the wet mud as the walls were built, creating a permanent connection between the city and the Pacific Ocean just a few miles away. But this choice of building material brings us to the first great mystery of Chan Chan. Building a world-class capital out of dried mud in a coastal valley is an extreme architectural gamble. While the region is usually bone dry, it sits directly in the path of the El Niño weather cycle. Every few decades, the climate shifts violently, dumping more rain in a single week than the valley usually sees in 10 years. Unbaked mud acts like a sponge when it gets wet. Under a heavy downpour, these massive walls should have simply melted back into the earth, turning the entire imperial capital into a flat plain of slurry. For reference, modern adobe structures in this same valley have been completely leveled by El Niño floods in recent decades. The mystery lies in why the Chimu chose to build the largest mud city on Earth in a place known for catastrophic rain. The physical evidence shows that they didn't just hope for the best, they possessed an advanced, long-term understanding of climate cycles that we are only beginning to grasp today. They engineered their walls with a specific taper, wider at the base and narrower at the top, to help shed water. They applied specialized protective coatings and designed complex drainage slopes that moved floodwater away from the structural foundations. They mastered the local environment so completely that their mud city stood firm for over 600 years, surviving storms that would have destroyed modern infrastructure. Surviving the rain was one challenge, but finding water to drink in a desert was another. To support a population of nearly 60,000 people, the Chimu had to rethink ancient water management. They excavated massive rectangular depressions deep into the desert floor known as huachaques. These were not your typical village wells. They were giant, walk-in reservoirs that reached down to tap directly into the natural water table hidden beneath the sand. These sunken gardens allowed them to grow crops and provide fresh water right inside the city walls, regardless of the desert heat. The engineering gets even more complex when you look outside the city. To keep the capital alive, the builders constructed a massive canal system that stretched for miles across the arid landscape. These channels were perfectly angled to pull river water from the distant Andes Mountains and guide it across the desert. For reference, maintaining a steady flow of water over miles of uneven sandy terrain requires a level of surveying precision that usually involves modern GPS and laser levels. The Chimu had to calculate the exact gradient of the land. If the canal was too steep, the water would move too fast and erode the dirt walls. If it was too flat, the water would just soak into the sand and disappear. They managed this delicate balance for centuries, creating a thriving green oasis in one of the harshest environments on the planet. This system was so vital that it eventually became their undoing. When the expanding Inca Empire arrived in the late 15th century, they found the 30-foot mud walls of Chan Chan nearly impossible to breach. The city was a fortress. However, the Inca realized they didn't need to break the walls. They just needed to find the pulse of the city. They located the main canal in the mountains and diverted the water away. Without their artificial river, the desert reclaimed the capital in a matter of weeks, forcing the Chimu to surrender their empire. Even after the fall, the mystery of the hidden wealth of Chan Chan continued to haunt the site. For centuries, looters and treasure hunters have tunneled through the adobe walls, searching for the gold that the Spanish chroniclers first described. In 1801, a single raiding party reportedly pulled over $3 million worth of gold artifacts from just one of the royal tombs. This constant pillaging has left the city scarred, yet the massive earthen walls remain. The sheer volume of dirt moved to build this metropolis, combined with the precision of the water systems, proves that the Chimu were masters of civil engineering. Leaving the massive adobe walls of the Peruvian coast, our journey brings us back to the dense jungles of North America. Moving deep into the Puc region of the Yucatan Peninsula, the landscape shifts from arid desert to a thick, low-hanging tropical forest. When early 19th century explorers began clearing the heavy brush in this area, they expected to find the typical jagged ruins of the Maya, but instead they uncovered a colossal structure that completely broke the standard architectural rules of ancient Mesoamerica. Rising over 100 feet into the jungle canopy is a massive building known as the Pyramid of the Magician. Unlike the sharp-stepped corners found at nearly every other site in the region, this massive monument features incredibly smooth, rounded edges. The entire base of the structure is elliptical, giving it a sweeping, almost aerodynamic profile that stands in stark contrast to the hard right angles usually associated with ancient stone construction. This site is the ancient city of Uxmal, and it reached its absolute peak of power during the late Maya period between 700 and 1000 AD. The rounded pyramid is the centerpiece of a sprawling urban complex defined by a highly specific building technique known as Puuc architecture. The defining feature of this style is the upper half of the buildings, which are completely covered in incredibly intricate mosaic-style stone facades. The builders did not just carve patterns directly into a flat wall. They carved thousands of individual geometric pieces of limestone and then fit them together like a massive, heavy jigsaw puzzle to create repeating patterns of serpents and complex lattice work. Assembling these interlocking stone mosaics across the faces of massive buildings requires an extreme level of mathematical precision and advanced spatial planning. To fully appreciate the scale of this stonework, you have to look at the nearby administrative building, which sits on a massive artificial platform right next to the pyramid. The upper facade of this single building stretches for over 300 feet and contains more than 20,000 individually carved stones. Every single piece was shaped using basic tools and set into place without the use of heavy metal lifting equipment. The sheer volume of limestone quarried, transported, and carved to build this city requires a logistical supply chain that rivals any modern construction site. The workers had to extract the raw stone from local quarries, drag it through the dense tropical heat, and then hand it over to master craftsmen who executed the flawless geometric designs. The true engineering anomaly of Uxmal lies in the physical construction of the main pyramid itself. Building a standard square pyramid is a relatively straightforward process of stacking blocks inward at a steady, predictable angle. Building a massive structure with curved elliptical sides is vastly more difficult mechanically. The architects had to constantly calculate the shifting radius of the curve at every single level, ensuring the heavy stone blocks locked together securely without compromising the structural integrity of the massive weight above them. The limestone blocks used for the outer casing had to be individually cut at very specific, varying angles to maintain that smooth, rounded outer profile as the building grew taller. Achieving this kind of flawless, curved geometry on a monumental scale requires a deep understanding of load-bearing physics that goes far beyond basic masonry. Beyond the visual complexity of the curved walls, the builders of Uxmal engineered a highly deliberate, unseen feature directly into the stone. The steep limestone staircase running up the western face of the pyramid is not just a walkway for priests and royalty. It is a highly tuned acoustic instrument built on a massive scale. If you stand at the base of these steps and clap your hands loudly, the sound wave travels up the face of the pyramid and interacts directly with the carved stone. Instead of returning a normal hollow echo, the structure alters the sound completely. The echo that bounces back down the steps sounds exactly like the distinct, high-pitched chirp of the quetzal bird. The quetzal was a deeply sacred animal to the Maya, representing the physical connection between the earth and the sky. This acoustic phenomenon is not a random coincidence or a trick of the surrounding jungle environment. The effect is created entirely by the specific physical dimensions of the stone stairs. The height and depth of each individual step are carved to incredibly exact measurements, acting together as a massive, physical, acoustic filter. When the sharp sound of a hand clap hits the stairs, the sound wave is instantly fractured across the limestone geometry. The delay between the sound hitting the bottom steps versus the top steps creates a sweeping frequency shift, perfectly replicating the descending chirp of the sacred bird. For reference, achieving this specific audio trick in modern architecture requires computer modeling and highly specialized sound dampening materials to precisely manipulate the bouncing sound waves. The builders of Uxmal somehow managed to calculate precise wave frequencies, and carved them directly into a massive stone matrix without any modern acoustic measuring tools. They designed a massive, load-bearing pyramid that also functioned as a flawless sound manipulator. It shows a society that possessed a working knowledge of acoustic physics that they seamlessly integrated into their grand civic engineering. The ability to mathematically predict how sound will behave when it hits a massive stone object, and then shape that object to mimic a specific biological sound, is an incredible technological achievement. It forces us to recognize that these ancient architects were working on a level of applied science that completely redefines our understanding of their true capabilities. While the Maya designed a massive stone matrix to filter and manipulate sound waves. On the exact opposite side of the globe, thousands of years earlier, another civilization utilized a remarkably similar geometric approach to filter a much heavier element. Leaving the humid jungles of the Yucatan, we travel to the searing heat of southwestern Iran, entering the desolate Khuzestan province. The landscape here is a sprawling arid plain where the sun relentlessly bakes the cracked earth and temperatures regularly soar to extreme highs. It is an environment entirely hostile to large-scale human settlement. In 1935, a team of British oil prospectors was flying a small aircraft over this empty expanse. They were surveying the ground for geological faults, searching for any signs of natural oil reserves hidden below the surface. Glancing out the window of their biplane, they noticed a massive, unnatural square footprint, casting sharp geometric shadows across the undulating sand dunes. The extreme symmetry of the shape immediately ruled out any natural rock formation, looking instead like a giant engineered puzzle piece dropped directly into the desert. Ground expeditions eventually navigated to the isolated coordinates. What they uncovered beneath the dirt required decades of intense manual excavation. The sheer volume of windblown sand that had buried the site over 3 millennia was staggering. Work crews pulled away hundreds of thousands of tons of heavy desert soil to reveal the remarkably preserved ruins of a massive, multi-tiered ziggurat. This sprawling structure, known today as Chogha Zanbil, is one of the largest and most complete step pyramids surviving from the ancient world. Historical records indicate the complex was built around 1250 BC by the Elamite king Untach-Napirisha. His goal was to establish a brand new religious capital, creating a sacred epicenter to unite the various factions of his expanding empire. The sheer volume of raw material used to construct this massive monument is an engineering marvel in its own right. The solid core of the pyramid is made of sun-dried mud, but the thick outer casing consists of millions of individually baked bricks. Firing that many bricks in a barren desert environment requires an enormous supply of scarce fuel and massive industrial kilns, representing a massive logistical undertaking before the first wall was even built. The architects employed a highly unique construction method to ensure the stability of the massive weight. Unlike other ziggurats from the region where new levels were simply stacked on top of old ones, all 5 tiers of Chogha Zanbil were built simultaneously from the ground up. They nested the square levels inside each other like a series of heavy, hollow boxes, tying them all together with deep subterranean foundations. The bricks were cemented together using locally sourced natural asphalt, a highly durable adhesive that protected the structure from seasonal erosion and shifting fault lines. This was an industrial-scale display of devotion. Creating millions of standard bricks requires intense labor, but the builders went even further. Thousands of these baked blocks were meticulously inscribed with cuneiform writing, dedicating the massive temple complex to their ancient deities. Walking along the lower walls today, the sharp text pressed into the clay over 3,000 years ago remains perfectly legible. It highlights a dedicated artisan class operating seamlessly alongside the heavy masonry laborers. The city surrounding the ziggurat was designed to house thousands of priests, royal guards, and citizens. Placing a bustling urban center directly in the middle of a harsh wasteland brings up a massive, immediate survival issue. Supporting a large population requires a constant, reliable source of clean drinking water. the ancient engineers solved the initial problem by excavating a massive canal across the desert, bringing a steady flow of water directly from a river located over 40 kilometers away. However, the water arriving at the complex was heavily saturated with mud, coarse silt, and harmful debris picked up during its long journey across the plains. Drinking it directly would quickly cause massive outbreaks of waterborne disease. To solve this critical health issue, the Elamites engineered a massive water filtration system right at the base of the Ziggurat. This was not a simple holding pond or a basic well. It was a highly advanced, multi-stage municipal water treatment plant built entirely out of baked clay and asphalt. The muddy river water was channeled into a series of large, deep-settling tanks. By deliberately widening the brick channels as the water entered the tanks, the builders forced the fast-flowing water to abruptly slow down. As the current lost its kinetic energy, gravity naturally took over, pulling the heavy silt and suspended mud directly down to the floor of the basin. Modern hydro engineers use this exact same physical process, known as flocculation and sedimentation, to treat city water supplies today. The Elamites achieved this without any modern chemical additives, relying entirely on the geometry of their brick channels to manipulate the speed and pressure of the water flow. Once the large debris settled out, the water flowed into a secondary series of chambers. The engineers coated the walls of specific holding tanks with thick layers of bitumen, creating a perfect waterproof seal to prevent the valuable surface water from seeping away into the desert floor. They then used bricks fired at highly specific temperatures to carefully control their exact level of porosity. The water was forced to slowly seep directly through these porous brick walls, which acted as a massive physical microfilter. This final stage trapped the remaining fine sediment, allowing clean, purified drinking water to pool in a designated basin on the other side. Operating a facility of this size required constant civic organization. Teams of workers had to regularly scrape the accumulated mud from the bottom of the settling tanks to keep the system running efficiently. The clean water was then carefully distributed to the massive population living around the Ziggurat, sustaining life in an environment that naturally rejects it. The physical mechanics of this filtration site force a major reevaluation of early Bronze Age capabilities. Historical accounts frequently describe societies from this era as operating on a very basic level, focused primarily on simple agriculture and bare survival. The existence of a dedicated municipal water treatment plant contradicts that assumption entirely. The Elamite engineers demonstrated a profound practical understanding of fluid dynamics, controlled sedimentation rates, and material permeability. They actively managed their natural resources using advanced civic engineering that easily rivals the mechanics of a modern municipal water plant. While Elamites in the Middle East used fired clay to filter their water, building upward to master their environment, thousands of miles to the east, another ancient civilization decided that the best way to conquer a harsh landscape was to abandon the surface completely. We journey to the blistering Turpan Basin in northwestern China. Here, nestled directly along the treacherous routes of the ancient Silk Road, sits a massive, leaf-shaped plateau of solid earth. Two deep river valleys, cut sharply along its edges to create a sheer drop on all sides. When early 20th century explorers arrived in this remote valley to map the region, they walked across the flat top of the plateau and realized they were standing on the roof of an entire city. This is Jiaohe, and its story is one of survival and extreme cultural collision. Dating back to roughly 100 BC, the city was originally the capital of the Jushi kingdom, before falling under the control of the mighty Han dynasty. To understand the creation of Jiaohe, you have to understand the brutal reality of the Silk Road. Merchants leading heavy caravans across the Taklamakan desert faced weeks of blistering heat, blinding sandstorms, and the constant threat of bandit raids. For these exhausted travelers, this isolated plateau was a desperate safe haven. The steep, natural cliffs acted as an impenetrable fortress against invading nomadic armies. Because the sheer drop provided perfect security, the builders never had to waste time dragging heavy stone to build outer defensive walls. Life inside Jiaohe was incredibly vibrant. It was a massive melting pot where East met West, serving as the front lines of global trade. Walking through the streets during its peak, you would hear a dozen different languages being spoken. Heavily armed garrison soldiers rubbed shoulders with wealthy merchants, trading silk, spices, and precious jade. Buddhist monks established sprawling monasteries right in the center of the city, turning it into a major hub for religious study. The air would have been thick with the smell of roasting meats, incense, and the constant braying of camels resting in the courtyards. Yet, despite the bustling, diverse population, the architects focused all their energy on a completely radical idea for city planning. Rather than stacking bricks or hauling timber to build upward, the builders of Jiaohe built their city backward. They started with the flat, tightly packed soil of the plateau and simply dug downward. They carved deep trenches to form the main streets and hollowed out massive square pits to create open courtyards. The dirt left standing naturally became the permanent walls of their homes, government offices, and large temples. Doing this requires an incredible level of foresight. You cannot easily add a new room or widen an alleyway once the surrounding earth has been cut away. Every single neighborhood and defensive watchtower had to be perfectly mapped out before the digging even began. Over several generations, workers hauled hundreds of thousands of tons of heavy dirt to the cliff edges, dumping the waste into the rivers far below. To create multi-story buildings, they would dig out the ground floor entirely and then carefully carve staircases leading up to a second level that remained flush with the original plateau surface. The ancient workforce achieved this massive removal using only hand tools and intense physical labor. Inside their sunken homes, they kept digging even deeper. They carved out underground storage bunkers to hoard grain and military supplies, ensuring they could survive long sieges from rival armies fighting to control the lucrative trade routes. This subterranean lifestyle also provided a brilliant escape from the brutal local climate. The Turpan Basin is famous for scorching hot summers and freezing, bitter winters. The thick, undisturbed earth naturally insulated the living spaces. It kept the sunken rooms remarkably cool during the blistering days and warm during the freezing nights, creating a highly stable and comfortable environment for the residents. Walking through the sunken avenues of Jiaohe today feels incredibly quiet, because the streets are dug deep into the earth. The high dirt walls absorb sound, creating a peaceful atmosphere that completely blocks out the howling desert winds. It is a brilliant adaptation to an environment that constantly tries to wear you down. Keeping a major military base alive in this dusty depression requires a massive amount of water. The surrounding seasonal rivers simply were not enough to support a growing population of soldiers, monks, and transient merchants. To solve this, the people of Jiaohe dug deep into the earth to create the Carrez well system. Working in near total darkness, miners carved long horizontal tunnels underground to pull fresh glacial meltwater from the distant Tian Shan Mountains directly into the city. By keeping the rivers completely hidden below the surface, they prevented the intense desert sun from evaporating their supply. They dug vertical shafts every few dozen yards, descending deep into the earth to carve out the horizontal channels by hand. These vertical shafts allowed workers to remove the excavated dirt and provided desperately needed fresh air to the miners working in the tight spaces below. The incline of the tunnel had to be steep enough to keep the water moving continuously, yet flat enough to prevent rapid erosion of the dirt walls. They managed to calculate this exact downward slope manually, working by candlelight while facing the constant threat of cave-ins. To achieve a perfectly graded underground river that spans several kilometers without modern survey equipment is an absolute marvel of ancient engineering. Jiaohe remains a stunning example of how ancient architects could mold the raw earth to perfectly regulate their climate and defend their wealth. They sunk an entire city into the dirt to protect their people and secure their vital trade routes in a harsh environment. Across the globe, another civilization would use this exact same dedication to structural engineering for a completely different reason. They were not building a sunken fortress for war, but rather constructing a highly specialized facility purely to protect a massive cache of fragile ancient data. The ancient Greek city of Ephesus sits right on the edge of the Aegean Sea in what is now modern-day Turkey. Around the year 110 AD, this was one of the wealthiest and most vibrant port cities in the entire Roman Empire. The streets were lined with massive marble monuments, bustling marketplaces, and wealthy merchants trading goods from across the known world. It was an era of intense cultural pride and deep intellectual pursuit. To cement a legacy in a city this crowded with wealth, a public figure had to build something truly staggering. That exact ambition led to the construction of a building that housed one of the greatest collections of knowledge in antiquity. The project was commissioned by a powerful Roman consul named Gaius Julius Aquila. He wanted to build a lasting monument to honor his father, the highly influential senator Tiberius Julius Celsus Ptolemaeus. Celsus was a fascinating historical figure, a local Greek who rose through the ranks to become a major player in Roman politics. Aquila poured his massive personal wealth into designing a structure meant to rival the legendary archives of Alexandria. He also made a highly unusual request by asking to bury his father directly beneath the ground floor. Placing a tomb inside a public building within the city limits was incredibly rare in Roman culture, elevating the site into both a working archive and a sacred memorial. For centuries after the fall of the empire, the ruins of this massive project lay hidden beneath a pile of shattered columns and Mediterranean rubble. When excavation teams finally began clearing the heavy debris in the early 20th century, they meticulously pieced together a stunning two-story marble facade. The sheer scale and ornate detail of the carving revealed the entrance to the library of Celsus. The facade itself is a brilliant display of visual trickery, designed to make the building feel overwhelmingly grand. The builders constructed the marble steps and the front columns with a slight outward curve, and they made the central columns slightly thicker than the outer ones. This specific optical illusion tricks the eye, making the building appear significantly wider and taller than it actually is when viewed from the street. Standing between these massive columns are 4 detailed statues representing the core virtues of Celsus, highlighting his wisdom, character, judgment, and knowledge. The entire front of the building faces precisely east, which was a highly calculated decision by the architects. This positioning ensured the massive front windows caught the early morning sun, providing the best possible reading light for scholars without needing dangerous open flames inside the archive. The main reading room was built to hold an incredible collection of roughly 12,000 parchment and papyrus scrolls. Storing that much fragile material in a coastal city presents a massive logistical nightmare. The air in Ephesus is thick with salty sea humidity, and the summers deliver relentless baking heat. Parchment and papyrus are highly sensitive organic materials that react violently to weather changes. If they get too damp, they rot and succumb to mold very quickly, and if they get too hot, they become incredibly brittle and crumble. Building a massive archive in this specific climate should have resulted in the complete destruction of the texts within a few short years. The survival of the library relied entirely on a hidden structural anomaly built directly into the foundation. The towering marble facade acts as a beautiful shell, but the actual storage facility behind it is designed completely differently. The architects engineered a highly advanced double-walled system to house the ancient scrolls. When visitors walked into the main room, they saw an interior floor paved with decorative marble and rows of rectangular niches carved into the walls where the scrolls were kept. However, the wall holding these niches was not the true outer wall of the building. Instead of placing the shelving directly against the thick exterior stone, the builders constructed an entirely separate set of inner brick walls. Between the heavy exterior stone and the interior brick room is a continuous gap measuring nearly 1 meter wide. This empty space wraps entirely around the central reading room, essentially suspending the archive inside a protective outer shell. This empty void acted as an active ancient climate control system. The thick outer walls absorbed the brutal daytime heat, acting as a massive thermal shield against the intense sun. The 1 meter gap prevented that heat from transferring directly into the inner room where the scrolls were resting. The architects also designed specific air vents within the walls to allow a constant breeze to circulate through the empty void. This continuous airflow prevented moisture from building up inside the masonry and constantly flushed out the heavy sea air. By keeping the air moving, the building perfectly regulated the humidity and temperature around the fragile paper. The entire structure functioned as a massive machine designed specifically to fight off the coastal weather. Achieving this level of environmental regulation shows that the builders understood exactly how their local climate behaved and engineered a brilliant countermeasure using only brick, stone, and empty space. Sadly, while the double walls protected the scrolls from the weather, they could not protect them from a massive earthquake and subsequent fire that ravaged the interior centuries later. The roof collapsed, destroying the collection and leaving the building in ruins. However, the survival of the facade and the clear physical evidence of the double wall foundation left the architectural blueprint intact. It highlights a society deeply invested in the long-term preservation of knowledge, willing to execute brilliant engineering solely to protect their history from the elements. If you enjoyed diving into these mysteries with us, then please like the video and make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue uncovering these forgotten chapters of human history every single week, and let us know which of these ancient sites surprised you the most, or if there is a specific historical mystery you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, stay curious.